Week 6 is a workshop for project development.
And what we're going to do today is I'll spend the first hour sharing some stories from my own work and my own research about community leadership, community resilience, community development projects. And these projects are mostly based in the United States because, as you all know, I moved here 5 years ago. But they're still North American focused, and I specifically chose projects in places that had a lot in common with some of the things happening here in Regent Park. So I'll share those. And then for the second hour, you all should have gotten a worksheet. So this worksheet, you'll spend some time thinking about the questions in the worksheet and writing your answers. I'll give you sort of like a time limit. There's a method where you just write from your consciousness. You don't think too hard, and all sorts of things tend to come out. And then we'll either pair up or be in small groups where you sort of share where you're at. And then I can we'll see how it works. Either I'll circulate or we'll share as a group depending on time. And then at the end of the workshop, if you give me your worksheet, then I'll read them all thoroughly, and then I can email you feedback to prepare you for your projects. Yes?
So why would you call it, what is the problem you are addressing?
Because that's a good question. So the project should be to address something that you see as an issue, that you see. So what is, so for example, let's take your project because you've talked a lot about it. You want to do a festival, a Latin festival, a Regent Park Latin Fest. So I would say the problem that you're addressing is that there isn't enough public infrastructure for festivals to showcase the very diverse cultures in Regent Park, or that the city of Toronto has not been very active in creating Latin festivals. And the reason I ask what is the problem you're addressing is because in general, if you do go on to apply for grants or for funding, you always want to be able to explain, okay, my project is addressing this problem. And it might seem like, so for example, to your point, like when you had this idea for a Latin Fest, that's something that you care about, it's your culture, it sounds fun, it's community building. You didn't maybe arrive at it by thinking of a problem, but if you can problematize your project, then it helps you get funding. So, but we'll talk about the worksheet. In an hour. But basically, I wanted to remind you all of this concept from the first day of class, the right to research. And remember, the right to research is any sort of activity or practice that you embark in to better understand what's happening around you and who you are in society. So whether that means reading the news every day, whether that means taking note of something that's changing in your neighborhood every day, whether that means talking to your neighbor to reflect about a policy or a program. It's some sort of engagement and documentation, a documentation that allows you to truly, deeply get more connected to your neighborhood and understand what's happening. So as you're developing your projects, I want you to think about how you are practicing your right to research. Like, what is the activity that you're doing that exemplifies this value? And then just as an example to remind you that you can do a project about anything in the neighborhood that you'd like, and you want to choose an issue that is of importance to you, that it has some sort of personal meaning. One of the questions on the worksheet is like, tell us a story about how this relates to you. So it could be something about the way you grew up and then you came to Regent Park and connect it that way. It could be something about your own experience navigating the neighborhood. One of our previous speakers, Chi Tam, she spoke about this idea of the story of self. So locate yourself in your project, and that's how you sort of design and tell the story of a compelling project. And your projects can be anything. So one thing that I ask you to think about is the fact that I'm going to ask you to share your project in 1 month. So whatever you choose has to be done in 1 month. So for example, a Latin festival, you can't do that in 1 month, but that's fine. You might have a bigger project in mind, but think about one small step that you can do in 1 month to get you to the larger goal. And that's why in the worksheet, there's a question that's what's one big sort of view or idea for your project and what's one small view for your project. And think about what's feasible within a month. And these are just ideas based on some of the skills we've discussed in the course. Maybe you want to write a grant. Maybe you want to write an op-ed for the newspaper. Maybe you want to write a letter to your city councilor. Maybe you want to figure out how to tell your story on social media, or you want to write a pitch that you would give neighborhood organizations. Maybe you want to organize a group of residents to do some conflict resolution or negotiating. Maybe you want to take the first step to organize around an issue. So, and there are other ideas that I'm sure you all will come up with too, but think about like one first small step that you can take by the end of the course, and I'll help you sort of develop them as well. But one of the things that you asked me for when I spoke to you all last week was some more examples or stories of community leadership and resilience to inspire you and to start thinking more about what's possible in Regent Park. So I've drawn from my own work, and as I said, a lot of the examples I'm about to share with you are from neighborhoods in the United States, but these neighborhoods have a lot of things in common with Regent Park. So you can sort of compare, contrast, analyze, and think about what you can take away from some of these. So the first project, the first case study is the Dudley Street Neighbourhood Initiative, which is based in Boston, Massachusetts. So you are all so taken and amazed with the idea of community land trusts. So I thought I would tell you the story of the very first community land trust. So Dudley Street Neighborhood Initiative is a community land trust, and it was founded in Boston, Massachusetts. And it's the first community land trust in the United States that developed. And as you know, community land trusts are nonprofit organizations that own land, and they lease it out for mission-aligned uses. So it could be affordable housing, home ownership, rental housing, farm sites, affordable commercial space, community gardens, open space, a playground. And the idea is to take land off the speculative market. And you all heard about this from Chi's presentation, but I thought I'd tell you the story of Dudley Street Neighborhood Initiative. So the Dudley Street Neighborhood Initiative, it's a community land trust in 2 neighborhoods in Boston, in Dorchester and Roxbury, which you can see on the map. And these neighborhoods are historically communities of color. They're underserved neighborhoods. And there was something happening in a lot of American cities in the 70s and 80s where they were suffering, a lot of cities, because of deindustrialization, were suffering from a financial crisis. Deindustrialization means that the economy was changing. A lot of jobs were moving outside of the United States to places where production could happen cheaper. A lot of manufacturing jobs were moving into sort of machinery, and then a lot of jobs were in like the knowledge economy. So people in these neighborhoods didn't necessarily have the skills to access jobs, and they were suffering from poverty. And then what was happening is a lot of landlords in these neighborhoods couldn't find tenants, or tenants wouldn't be paying their rent because of all of this economic depression. And so what started happening is that on purpose, landlords started burning down their properties and their buildings. So why do you think they would do that? Why do you think a landlord would burn down their property on purpose? Exactly, everyone knows. Exactly. So on purpose, landlords started burning down their properties, And then they would collect their fire insurance money and they wouldn't have to worry about maintaining or managing the property. So then what ends up happening is all over Dorchester and Roxbury, you have these vacant lots. And then what starts happening is that residents in Boston saw that these are basically like bombed out neighborhoods. They've just been like burnt to the ground. And they just started dumping trash there. So small businesses or residents that maybe didn't have room for trash in their neighborhood would like come and just like dump like old mattresses, furniture, just go to this area and start dumping and start dumping and start dumping. So the neighborhood really, really, really was not well maintained and was in this crisis. So the city of Boston and then all of these community foundations came together to say, okay, what are we going to do? We need to fix this neighborhood. We need to get it cleaned up. This is valuable land. We need to build affordable housing. We need to do things. And of course, when they started doing this, there was no residents at the table, and there was no good community representation. And one resident named Gus Newport, he was the former director of what is now the Dudley Street Neighbourhood Initiative. He said, why do some of us serving on nonprofit boards feel that we have enough information at our fingertips without engaging those we seek to help? Isn't it a right of our clients to assist in informing the methods and processes that should be used in upgrading their quality of life? And what started happening was when the city and foundations would meet, they would, post a notice that you all are familiar with, and they'd say, this public meeting is happening, this is happening. And at first, those meetings weren't really well attended. Like one resident would come or two residents would come, but they would be like the noisemaker residents. And so they would come and they would make a lot of noise, and then they would take the information back to the neighborhood, and they started collecting more and more people started going. And as a collective and working together, they were able to form the Dudley Street Neighbourhood Initiative, which is the first community land trust. So actually, there's a really great documentary about it. It's a 10-minute documentary. So I thought I would share it with you and show it to you for you to see the story and sort of what the neighborhood looks like.
When I first moved to this neighborhood, the neighborhood had a lot of garbage, a lot of trash, a lot of vacant lots. It was like a no man's land.
Everyone was moving out, and people that were moving in saying, oh, this is a ghetto.
More and more houses were being abandoned. And then a number of the owners of those buildings decided that one of the ways that they could get their money back and maybe even make a quick profit was to burn their houses down.
Every night there was a fire. It was like this block, the next block, the block after that. And each time they'd burn a house, they'd tear it down. You had another vacant lot, so I saw the vacant lots increase. I saw the amount of crap on the vacant lots increase, and it just kept getting worse and worse and worse.
Preceding the first community meeting, there was literally months of work that went into the planning for it. What we wanted to do was to think about how we could refocus our grant making. What could we do, even as a small foundation, what could we do that might attract other larger foundations to help out, to see what we can do in the Roxbury area? That probably is the neediest area in the city.
I asked them, I said, well, how many of you live in this neighborhood? And nobody raised their hand.
My initial impression of Che was that she was an agitator. She was either sent in or voluntarily went in to disrupt the meeting.
You always have people from downtown or somewhere else coming and telling you what you need in your neighborhood.
The fact was that we had made a mistake. We just had misjudged and really not thought through how we could put a neighborhood initiative together without including the residents. It was a rather incredible mistake.
In a series of small meetings, we were able to redo the governance structure in order to make sure that residents were included, and residents were the majority on this new board of directors.
We decided the board members would be elected by the community every 2 years. Each ethnic group would have 3 seats, and the rest of the seats would be for local housing and human service organizations, local businesses, and religious institutions. We kept the name Dudley Street Neighbourhood Initiative, or DSNI, and agreed we'd work together to revitalize the whole community.
We wanted to come up with some short-term organizing campaigns for folks to start to see that they do in fact have some power and can have some victories.
We're in a neighborhood doing a survey on neighborhood conditions.
As we did a lot of the door knocking, what we found was that the vacant lots were just about the #1 issue that people kept bringing up.
There was unscrupulous contractors from throughout the city, from throughout the greater Boston area, would come and dump their garbage on these lots.
You had to hold your nose when you drove down the street. I mean, it was terrible. No human being should have to live in that kind of situation.
The dumping affected everyone who lived here, but we came from different cultures and spoke different languages, and it was hard to communicate and work together. So we had to find different ways to get all the groups involved.
Produção e apresentação de Jorge Fidalgo e Adalberto Teixeira. Renovação.
As I started working for the DSNI as a community organizer, I used the Cape Verdean radio show as a tool to educate people about what was happening with the DSNI and what the DSNI was about. We organized the community to go to City Hall, to go to state agencies and demand services. 1 month after pledging to help us clean up the lots, many of which were in fact owned by the city provided equipment for neighborhood cleanup.
We are cleaning because this is Roxbury, and Roxbury is gonna be fucking clean. It's gonna be clean. Not only this lot, the whole neighborhood, because we take pride on it.
They picked this community to do their illegal dumping. Why do they do that? Do they think we can't fight back? I think this action demonstrates that we're going to fight back.
Officials estimate there are about 10 illegal transfer stations around the city. Tonight represents the first time that officials have ever tried to lock any up.
The day we were able to padlock those transfer stations, it was great. It was great. And to actually see us together try to do something and have it happen, this was like a symbol of hope. I mean, it's like you couldn't tell us that we weren't going to make, big changes. It was great.
We had drafted for Mayor Flynn, a concept plan for Roxbury around Dudley Square.
When you start hearing about other parts of the city, like the South End, where they were moving people of low income out and bringing in people of high income in, and you just figure it's going to happen here. They're trying to push us all out. It was very scary. It was very, very scary.
Ray Flynn resorted to acting toward the neighborhoods in a way that was very similar to the early urban renewal attempts.
Community leaders were infuriated by the failure of city and state officials to include residents in the planning process.
The fact that we have no specifications, nothing in print in front of us so that we can look at it and respond intelligently, I think is a slap in the face.
It really just sounded like a plot for gentrification. They're coming through the South End, they're gonna do Dudley Square, in just a few minutes, they're gonna go right down Dudley Street. I mean, we're only a hop, skip, and a jump from downtown. How many times are we gonna allow people to push us from one place to another in the city?
There's nothing like getting taken to the woodshed publicly for you to think clear out. Nothing does as much good for your thinking as that. And I spent the next 4 months going to the woodshed.
We wanted to improve this neighborhood on our own terms. So we hired urban planners who would look to us for solutions.
Our approach was really to listen and to sit down and say, describe for us the kinds of things that you're experiencing, and then we will begin to translate those in terms of strategies, issues, priorities.
Today we come together to celebrate a very unique plan that stresses services to rebuild the spirit of this community as well as to develop the neighborhood.
The Dudley Street Neighborhood Initiative plan announced today will make some dreams here reality. The initiative report was 9 months in the planning by local residents. It focuses on developing the area with the use of $134 million in public funds.
Having the city adopt our plan really turned the tables on how development is done. You know, that top-down effect was not happening. It was a bottom-up. We met together in the middle. And that's very, very significant because it's totally opposite to what they've always done.
While we were building partnerships to get the first homes built, we were also working to create other kinds of opportunities.
I really truly believe that if the youth in the community could become more involved in the community and become more involved with helping others, that they would give more value for life and respect for themselves. New Baton Rouge started in 1990 with one person. Today we have a membership list of over 200 youths in the neighborhood.
As the Dudley community, we need to support the young people, nourish them, and help them and cultivate them as if they were crops.
My name is Jason Webb. I'm 14 years old. I have devoted half of my life to the community.
There still are real questions as to, will people support this housing? Will people live here? We know what the answer is. Get the housing built, make it the right housing, which you know it will be, and people will move in and be very happy.
In 10 long years, but we have tried.
Hi, my name is Ruby Grice, and I'm one of the first home buyers. I moved out of the area a while back, and I'm happy to say that I'm coming back home. It's been a long process. It's a headache. I think I've gotten a couple of gray hairs, but thank God for coloring. I will use it. And thank you again.
Getting some free food. Get some of this cake.
Well, we moved off of this street in 1962. Oh, it feels good to come back home. It seems like this is home, whereas I started here when I first moved to Boston, and I know this will probably be where I end up at. It makes it feel like it was 37 years ago, everyone mingling and having a nice time.
I guess the biggest thing happened was when my 11-year-old said to me the night that we moved in that Saturday night, he says, "Mommy, I'm so proud of you." And I was like, I did it, you know. And that was my biggest reward, was my son telling me that.
How do you develop confidence in a community, in individuals, to speak, to stand up for, to strive, to fight, and to have hope? I think those are the key challenges. It's not so much what building are you going to build or what social program are you going to change, but it's the people part of it, the part that has people investing themselves to make a difference, to make a change, and to see that hope. That's the challenge.
But a very similar story to this community as well. I mean, it's different in that there was no developers involved in sort of gentrifying or building new development, but there were city officials trying to improve the neighborhood without the voice of residents, and then a few engaged, louder residents showed up, organized, hired their own planners, pushed their plan in front of the city, and then the rest is history. And this organization, Dudley Street Neighbourhood Initiative, it still exists. It is a community land trust. Because it's the first of its kind, a lot of other new community land trusts actually will contact them or go to Boston to learn how to do this type of organizing and work really well. Okay, so that's case study 1. So case study number 2 is also about Boston. I'm from Boston, which is why I know of a lot of examples there. And this is different. This is not so much about a diverse neighborhood that's trying to organize amongst themselves to improve. This is about an ethnic enclave, Chinatown. We have a couple of Chinatowns here in Toronto. And it's actually about a 100-year history of Boston's Chinatown trying to organize for their own branch library. So basically, this is an image of the neighborhood, of a building in the neighborhood in 1896. And at that time, they had what was called a reading room, which is kind of like a mini branch library. And in 1896, the neighborhood wasn't quite Chinatown yet, but it was just an overall immigrant neighborhood. So people were there from a lot of European countries, Eastern European, but China as well. I think at that time there was probably like 200 to 300 people from China living in the neighborhood. And so this reading room was really important because it provided materials to all of these new immigrants in their language. It helped them find resources for education and for employment in their new city. And I don't know if you all know this, but public libraries, I mean, they're such an amazing asset to neighborhoods and communities, right? Like they're free, anyone can go there, you can access reading materials, internet, the librarians are there to answer your questions. So I don't know if you know this, but actually the founding behind the public library is actually quite racist. And the very first public library was in Boston, Massachusetts. No, the Boston one came before New York. So Boston, Massachusetts had the very first public library, and Toronto actually has the very biggest branch system. And they're wonderful institutions. But the reason they were founded in the late 1800s is because, so Boston was a very white town, and there was a lot of rich elite people that had, come from England, living there, and then in the 1800s, lots and lots and lots of immigration is occurring, and lots of newcomers are coming, and a lot of these people didn't speak English, they had low levels of educational attainment, and so the rich Boston elite were really nervous about this, and they were scared, and they were like, who are all these foreigners, and how are we going to deal with them in our society? And so they came up with the idea of a public library. And the goal and the motivation of the public library was actually to Americanize newcomers. The idea was like, immigrants are coming, we're scared that they're poor and they're gonna cause disorder in the city. But if we have this like free institution with a lot of American materials, with American values, we can Americanize them and assimilate them. And then what started happening as time went, these sort of reading rooms, like the one you see pictured there, they started popping up and the city started funding them in immigrant neighborhoods. And then librarians that worked in those reading rooms were very compassionate, empathetic people, and they cared about education. And slowly the library became a place to actually accommodate newcomers rather than to like forcibly assimilate them. And so this reading room, it played a really important role in what's today's Boston's Chinatown, but historically a very immigrant neighborhood. Now, the other thing that's really interesting about branch libraries is that when there's a recession or economic depression, their usage goes up, which makes sense. People are going there to look for jobs, maybe use the internet, figure out what to do. But also in North American cities, when there's a recession and the city needs to make budget cuts, one of the first things that gets cut is the library. It's seen as not really that important, but it is that important. And so what happens in Boston's Chinatown, or this immigrant neighborhood, is that in the 1930s, the Boston Public Library chose to close 4 branches, and of course they closed the branches in all of the minority immigrant neighborhoods. Every library system in North America has a big, giant main branch, And often those big giant main branches are in very high income areas and they're very ostentatious. And then these branch libraries that are sort of spread out through the city, those are the ones that they decide to close. So in the late 1930s, the city decides to close Boston's library. And there was a lot of organizing that happened around this. So you can see on the slide from this like protest meeting, all the different immigrant groups and community organizations, they came together to organize and to protest the closing of this branch library. But it didn't work. The city still shut it down. And so what happens then is between sort of the late 1930s when this library closes, all the way until the late 1980s, so like 50 years, there wasn't really a branch library in the neighborhood, even though residents would ask for it and organize it. And the public library would do things like they would have something called a bookmobile. So sometimes this little truck with flags from the various different countries of immigrants that lived in the neighborhood would come in and drive around a couple of times a week. Then, during post-World War II in the 1950s, when the economy was better, they reopened it for a few years, but then it shut down again because the economy was bad. So this library wasn't really sticking in Chinatown. And then what happens is in the 1960s and 80s, the movement for a library, it basically just lost momentum. People became more interested in other issues in Chinatown, which are very common among Chinatowns in North America: gentrification, preservation, employment opportunities, all of those things. And the civil rights was happening in the 1960s, and this organization called the Chinese Progressive Association was formed, and they were basically fighting for economic justice in Chinatown. And then part of what this organization did is they created an intergenerational youth program and a history program, because a lot of young people were now growing up in the neighborhood, and the organization thought it was really important for these young people to know their history, to know where they came from, to know about their ancestors. So young people were connecting with their elders, historians were giving lectures about the neighborhood, and through that programming, all these young people learned that there was once a library in this neighborhood, and that for many, many years, different versions of it would come and go, but the city never actually funded it to be there permanently. And so that these young people got really interested in this, and they said, we should have our own public library. We have to travel so far to access the main branch. That's not right. There's such a unique, varied population here, young people, elders. And so then these young people got together and they wrote a survey to ask residents of the neighborhood, do you want a library? If you wanted a library, what would you do there? They administered it to 250 people, and they collected all this data about wanting a library. And then from there, they started a movement. And I learned about the movement in 2009, 2010, when I was a graduate student doing my master's in urban planning. And so all the way back then, I learned about the movement, and I thought, wow, this is really fascinating. And I started researching it. And a little bit more context about Chinatown. So here's a map of Boston's Chinatown. And all the areas in orange are Chinatown. But then the areas in purple they belong to a big medical center and to universities that are encroaching on the land. So there's a lot of tension over land in this neighborhood. And one of the big issues in the neighborhood is gentrification, and is the fact that Chinatown is disappearing. And there's a lot of master planning processes going on amongst residents, because similar to the other case study I showed you, residents didn't like how cities were just making decisions for them. And so what these residents decided was, not only would having a public branch library be really important in terms of providing residents with access to library materials, programs, a safe place, but also it will be symbolic. If you have a library in Chinatown that's called the Chinatown Library, then you can never erase Chinatown. It actually becomes a symbol of the neighborhood. It's a place where all the organizations and all the history of the neighborhood can actually be displayed and archived. And so then it became not only a movement for this community facility, but also as a way to memorialize and preserve the neighborhood's history. And so in the 1990s and 2000s, the movement really gets born again with the group, the work the youth did with this master plan Chinatown process. And they keep organizing. And then I told you that I learned about it in 2009, 2010. And what happens then is that there's all these like luxury condo developers starting to build fancy buildings in Chinatown, and the neighborhood is slowly disappearing and everybody's really tense. And some rich residents that moved into that luxury building learned about this movement and actually donated some funds and said, well, what if we help you build your own library? And so then with the help of some universities nearby, like Harvard University, and these rich residents that are actually gentrifiers, and now all these Chinatown groups, they built a temporary library on the ground floor of the luxury condo building, and they called it the Storefront Library. And so they collected donations. Architecture students from the Harvard Graduate School of Design designed these interiors and built the interiors. They went to the Boston Public Library and they said, look, you're not giving it to us, we're doing it ourselves. What can you donate? So then the Boston Public Library gave some books. And then for 3 months, they ran the Storefront Library. And the point of this was not just to, have the library, but also to collect data and use it as a demonstration project to show the city that, look, we need a library, it's being used, people are coming, like, what are you going to do for us? And then after 3 months, it shut down because then the developer wanted to lease the space to a business that would give it money. And it closed, and then it kind of bounced around to any building with a vacant space. Residents would organize and say, can we have a library here? Can we have it here? And they just keep at it. They keep collecting data. And then I finished, so I did my master's in planning in Boston. I worked in the area for a while, and then I went to do my PhD. And I finished my PhD in 2018. And then in 2018, when I was graduating and I was moving to Toronto, I see this headline in the news. After 62 years, a branch library returns to Chinatown. So I find this story really amazing because, as you know, the neighborhood formed in the 1850s. They had a library until about 1950. And from 1950 to 2018, this library is sort of coming and going and never permanent. And the city has never given the funds or said, okay, this should be a permanent establishment or fixture. And it just shows that sometimes things take a really, really long time, but when community is like so committed and just keeps asking and keeps organizing and keeps going, then they get their library. So I find it really amazing. And now I am actually, I researched the story up until 2010 very closely. Then I got busy with other things. So now I'm trying to go back and look at all of the different iterations of organizing that led to it. And they're doing a whole planning process, a whole design process. But again, as I said, what's really amazing about this story is that it's not just a library that will cater to the needs of elders or Chinatown residents, but it also now is symbolic. Like Chinatown can never be erased because now there's a Chinatown library. So that is case study number 2. Okay, and then case study number 3 is about 2 different organizations that I worked with in the post-disaster context. So I do a lot of research about how communities organize after natural disasters, which are often also called man-made disasters, because even though it comes from the environment, the way that it affects a city or a country has a lot to do with the policies that humans put in place. And so the 2 case studies I'm going to talk about are from post-Katrina New Orleans and post-Sandy New York City. So just a little bit of context. Hurricane Katrina hit New Orleans in 2005. And as you can see from the map, the darker the purple, the more flooding. And 80% of the city was underwater. And of course, communities of color were the hardest hit. And then 7 years later, Superstorm Sandy hit New York City in 2012. That's this map. The damage wasn't as large of a scale as it was in New Orleans, but the areas on the coast that are darker blue, those areas were damaged really, really badly, and those specific areas could be compared to the devastation in New Orleans. And similarly, it's communities of color that are bearing the worst brunt of this. And that has to do, again, with historically, with land policy and housing policy, cities relegate climate vulnerable neighborhoods or properties to communities of color because then it's not prime property that you want to sell to your elite, rich, white residents. So that's why you sort of see disaster effects in lower income area really badly. But I want to tell you two really inspiring stories about organizing that happened in these two contexts. So the first is of this youth media collective called 2 Cent Media. So when Hurricane Katrina hit New Orleans, most of the city had to evacuate or leave. Some people had to stay because they had nowhere to go or couldn't leave, but a majority of the city left. And there was a group of young people that were local students, either in high school or in local colleges or universities in the area. And they were African-American youth. And before the storm started, they were talking about how the local cable television station never created shows or content or news that represented them or that was interesting to them. So one of the young people in this group of friends, he was actually studying public broadcasting and television at his local college. And he said, why don't we start our own television show? And it can be a fictional show, but the theme or the idea can be, what is it like to be Black in New Orleans? How does a Black person navigate New Orleans? So they have this idea to create this show, and then the storm hits. And all these young people go to different places. People move to Texas, to California, to Chicago. They all leave New Orleans because they can't be there. And they stay in touch with each other. And then when they come back, they say, okay, we still have to make the show, but now we need to focus it on rebuilding and recovery. And I could give you a whole lecture about sort of the racist policies of rebuilding New Orleans, but we don't have time for that. But there was a lot of complicated politics happening in rebuilding the city. And so these young people were trying to create their own videos to tell their story. And now YouTube is so ubiquitous and part of our lives. We all go on YouTube all the time. But YouTube was invented right when this disaster hit. So the idea of making your own videos and posting it on this public site was not normal. It was, we have Focus Media Arts, you have Regent Park TV. Nothing like that had ever been done before. So these young people, they start making videos about what's happening as they move back and they come together. They start making videos about what's happening and how they're navigating and experiencing it. And then they use these videos as an organizing tool. So they would put flyers up all over the city and they'd say, 2 Cent video being unveiled at like Club 500. See you there at 8 p.m. And so then young people would gather together to see the video, and then the video would be really provocative. And then young people would talk about what they were seeing and hopefully take action or organize. So one of the things that was happening after Hurricane Katrina in New Orleans, when people could start going back, is this idea of disaster tourism. So there was areas of the city that were really obliterated, and they're very poor areas where people are living in extreme poverty. And then private tour companies would actually take tourists who came to visit New Orleans for fun, for music, or for food on a tour to see the devastation. And many of the young people that were part of this 2 Cent Media Collective lived in those neighborhoods, and they were really, really offended. So I want to show you a video that they made. No, why are you guys doing this?
Hey, yeah, Lou.
Hurricane Katrina was the biggest national disaster to hit American soil. And nearly 2 years later, this area is still devastated. But you know what? We made sure we preserved it strictly for your tourism. For about $75, you can take one of these many tour buses that's traveling around this city. It looks like there's more money to be paid in devastation and regeneration. If y'all keep paying your money to see it, should we rebuild it?
So basically, New Orleans is a city that gets a lot of tourism, right? A lot of people go to visit because it has good music, it has good food. And so people would go for fun, but then there were these private tour companies operating these devastation tours where they would take people to these low-income communities of color. So as I was saying, members of the collective saw this was happening and was really offended, and so they created this satirical video. So when they create this video, it goes viral. And the video gets a lot of attention, so much so that then the city outlawed disaster tourism, that it wasn't allowed anymore. And the reason their name is 2 Cent, they didn't really have a name at first when they were operating. And then what ended up happening was that, as I said, YouTube was really new, and as they were posting these videos, you can see they use rap and hip hop. Famous rap and hip hop artists actually saw what they were doing and they wanted to contribute. And a couple of them even contacted these young people and said, I'm coming to New Orleans, can you show me around or show me what's needed? And I believe one of the artists, Most Def, I don't know if you all are familiar, but Most Def went and said to these young people, what you're doing is really amazing. Even if your voice shakes, you have to give your 2 cents. And so that's why they started calling themselves 2 Cent Media. And they were making these videos. And now, like I said, when we watch these videos now, it's like we see videos all the time, but at the time, nobody was doing this. So I'm giving you a lot of stories about firsts, you know, like first community land trust, first YouTube youth activists. Yeah.
Let me guess, the bus driver person is a white person.
Yeah.
So that money was going for him.
So the money was going for whatever tour company that set it up. So white people, rich white people would come, pay $75 or whatever the price of the tour, and then whoever organized the tour, whatever private company, the bus driver, they're all profiting by everyone else seeing the devastation that the hurricane caused. Yeah. So that footage in the video in the beginning where you saw people like looking, those were real disaster tours that these young people filmed. Yes. Yeah, it's true. It's true. As I said, I could give a whole lecture on this. So before Hurricane Katrina, New Orleans was a majority minority city. Most residents were of color. And afterwards, developers, the government used the disaster as a way to gentrify. A lot of people of color didn't return, and now it's now a majority white city. And it's a very sad story. It's a bit discouraging. But in that sadness, you have really amazing initiatives like this. Yeah. Okay, so then the last example that I'll give you is about internet, actually. So what you're seeing here are images of a really big social housing development in Brooklyn, New York City called Red Hook. So these houses are called the Red Hook houses. I don't know if you've ever heard of the Red Hook houses. Yeah, they're more high-rise than mid-rise, but it is a similar sort of large-scale site plan. And I'll tell you a little bit more about Red Hook, but this is where it is in New York City. So this is New York City, that's Brooklyn. Red Hook is the area outlined in red. So you can see that it's surrounded by water on all 3 sides, which makes it climate vulnerable. And then on the other side, there's actually a highway. So it's a neighborhood in New York City that's not well connected to the rest of the city. And this neighborhood, it's a 20-minute walk to the nearest subway station. And 75% of the neighborhood is Black or Latino. And about 40% live below the poverty level, and they don't have access to internet in their homes. So I'm going to give you a little more context, because I actually see it's different from Red Hook, because Red Hook is actually on like prime real estate. It's so close to downtown. But the way it's similar is that there's very different varying demographics and populations in this neighborhood. So as I said, it's home to one of the largest social, or in the States we say public housing developments, the Red Hook houses. And those Red Hook houses house about 6,500 to 700 residents, which is about 60% of the entire neighborhood population. And so the area in red is where Red Hook houses are. But then, and this area is considered the front of the neighborhood. But then there's a back of the neighborhood, and that's the area in purple. And the back of the neighborhood basically became home to a lot of middle-class artists and creative people seeking cheaper housing. And they're the first outsiders to come into Red Hook in the late 1990s. And they started settling in this area, which is referred to as the back. And this street, Van Brunt Street, is sort of that back neighborhood commercial corridor. So I just want to sort of show you what the neighborhood looks like. So this is, as you saw, this is the Red Hook houses in the front of the neighborhood. This is what the commercial corridor looks like at the front of the neighborhood. But then in the back of the neighborhood, these are the houses. So very different type of houses. And this is what their commercial corridor looks like. So in this way, I find it similar to Regent Park, because you have these like really extreme populations inhabiting the same geography. In Regent Park, it seems like those geographies are all interlaced, or the buildings are interlaced. In this neighborhood, it's like this section and this section. But basically, so this neighborhood has a really strong community development organization, or a youth development organization, I should say. It's called the Red Hook Initiative. The Red Hook Initiative provides a lot of programming to young people. It does a lot of community work, a lot of the work that many of you are involved in. The Red Hook Initiative does that in this neighborhood in Red Hook. And one of the things that the Red Hook Initiative spearheaded was the idea that the neighborhood should have their own internet network. So as I said to you, about 40% of residents that were living in those public housing units, they didn't have internet in their homes. And as we all know now, I mean, even before now, but like internet's a lifeline. When we were all stuck at home, that's what we needed. How do you get your news? How do you do your work? How do you go to school? So this youth development organization said, we really need to figure out how to supply the neighborhood with internet. And so they decided to build a community internet network. So I don't know if any of you have heard of this before, but a community internet network is when you take the infrastructure, the hardware, they're called routers, and you install them across a certain geography, and the routers all talk to each other. So when you're in the geography of the router, you can get onto a network, and one of those routers connects to the larger internet, and that's how you get on the network. So as long as you are in the geography of the routers and you turn your iPhone or computer on, it will say, do you want to join this network? And you can join. So they decided to build that. And the routers can take these different sort of configurations. They can be what's called a mesh network, or what's called a hub and spoke model. And then all these circles are the routers. That's what these images on the brick buildings are. And then they all talk to each other, and you have your own internet. So the nonprofit Red Hook Initiative said, okay, we're gonna build this so our residents always have access to internet. And this does a lot of really important things. It ends reliance on big telecom companies. It spurs local economic development. If a nonprofit organization is providing the internet and community people are building the internet, you can pay them to do it rather than some really big telecom company like Bell or Rogers or something. It helps amplify voice, because when you have your own internet network, you actually have your own local community server, and then you can design and build your own applications, your own radio shows that come out of that internet, so you can have voice. And then they also facilitate disaster preparedness. So when there's a really bad storm or a hurricane, sometimes the power goes out and we don't have access to internet, but these local internet infrastructures, they can actually resist those storms. And oftentimes these routers are battery operated. So this local Wi-Fi network was a project of the Red Hook Initiative. And their motivation, it wasn't even any of those things that I just listed. Their main motivation was Red Hook gets a lot of bad press. So this is very similar to Regent Park before revitalization. There's always headlines in the news about Red Hook that just aren't great. So this is an example of one. Life in Brooklyn's Forgotten Section. In Red Hook, 3-year-olds hear gunfire and duck for cover. And similar to Regent Park, Red Hook residents say that when I say I'm from Red Hook, people don't want to hire me for a job. I know that's part of the history of Focus Media Arts. So the nonprofit said, okay, if we can build this network, then we can tell our own stories about our neighborhood and change the narrative of our neighborhood. Very similar to Focus Media Arts. And this is the former director of technology at the Red Hook Initiative, and he was also a resident of Red Hook. And what he actually told me was, you know, there are these two sides to the neighborhood, the public housing and the middle-class homeowners, which you all saw on the map. So the hope is that the network is a virtual space where everyone meets together. So right now, these two sides of the neighborhood, they're living very separately, but maybe if we build a network that everyone uses and is a part of, then you can bring these different types of people together. So they start building this network, like to have a radio station, to have, you know, to do all of this community work, and then Superstorm Sandy hits. And as you can see, Red Hook is right there. It experiences a lot of devastation. All the power is out in this neighborhood. There's like no electricity, no power. Nobody has access to internet, except if you're standing next to one of these routers, because those routers were able to sustain the storm. So in the days after the storm, you just see tons and tons of residents standing next to a router, and they're able to get onto a network. And so then what starts happening is that this network becomes known as like a resilient technology. And the story becomes like, oh, Red Hook Youth, because it was young people that were building it, Red Hook Youth build resilient technology, Red Hook Youth build like internet for the neighborhood. And then the Red Hook Initiative starts using the network to start tweeting what's happening after the disaster and who needs help and what resources are needed. And they're using the network to do that. And they, like, within like 24 hours, I believe, surpassed $500,000. And then also, the disaster was bringing people together in an unprecedented way. So this woman who also worked at the Red Hook Initiative, she said neighbors who lived in private houses were relying on the volunteer support of youth who were living in public housing and vice versa. Everyone was hit with the damage. People wanted to help each other across the neighborhood. So that was already happening organically. And I should mention that when the storm hit, at that point, they had only installed 2 routers. So the network was actually quite small. But when everyone saw, oh my gosh, this is a resilient technology and it's the only way we're getting internet, immediately the nonprofit said we need to invest and we need to expand the network and we need to build it out. And so they started doing that. And in order to do that, these young people that were building it had to go to the other side of the neighborhood to ask some of the middle-class homeowners and some of the institutions there, can we put a router here and explain, like, this is the only internet in the neighborhood? And people who before said no or wouldn't correspond with these young people were like, yes, okay, like, come into my home, build the router. So this map shows, for example, there's this church here called the Visitation of the Blessed Virgin Mary Church. Originally, before the storm, young people went there to ask, oh, can we put a router on your roof to build this network? And the church was like, no. And young people said they felt like the church was racist. Yeah, and you were thinking the church was up. But then, after the disaster, when the network was working, the church said, okay, yeah, build it, put it up. And so then all these young people are putting these routers everywhere. And the Red Hook Initiative starts a whole program called the Digital Stewards Program, where they're paying young people and training them in how to build an internet. And so now the money is staying in the neighborhood, and these young people are building the internet, and they get all this training program about media and technology. And so this was the network as of 2016 when I was last there. So the orange circles are the routers that the first generation of digital stewards put in, and then the purple are the second generation. And then what you can see is that it goes across the front and the back of the neighborhood, bringing people together. So a lot of events for the neighborhood to get to this point. What I'm looking at now, what I'm really interested in is how did this network survive and thrive during the pandemic? Because I was last there in 2016. So I want to know, like, in 2020, 21, 22, were people using the network? Was there still this cooperation going on? What happened? But a really cool story about community building. So those are all my case studies for you. So now we've gone way over time, but I want you to think a bit about your projects. So you've heard from all these speakers over the last weeks and all these different initiatives. I shared some stories from my own work. And we spoke very briefly about this idea of the story of now, the story of us, and the story of self. The story of now is a story that explains urgency, like, why do we need to tackle this problem now? Like, why is it so important? The story of us explains why we need to do it collectively, what are our shared goals and values. And the story of self is thinking about why you have a inspiration or a call to do this work and telling that story. And when you're able to tell a story that brings all three of those together, it's a very powerful story. It takes a lot of practice to do that. So what I did is I created this worksheet for you for the scope of this class. And I want you to spend, I guess the next, it's 7:20. I want you to spend 20 minutes, everybody just on their own for 20 minutes, writing your answers to the questions. So what's the problem you're trying to address? Why is this problem important to you? Try to answer this one through a personal story. Describe one small step you can take to address this problem. Describe one large step you can take to address this problem. And how will you practice the right to research to take this small or large step? And then finally, think about in 1 month when the class is over and we have our ceremony where you get your gift certificates, what is possible to complete in 1 month to take your small or large step by the end of the course?
Thank you so much for watching. Don't forget to like, comment, share, and subscribe to our YouTube channel. Also follow us on social media, and for more information, check out our website.